Brian Thompson and Alicia Rivera looked like the perfect newlyweds, smiling in every photo, holding hands at every step. But just 3 days into their honeymoon, Alicia was dead, and Brian's story didn't add up. What began as a romantic escape ended in bloodshed, a staged accident, and a chilling truth that revealed Alicia's perfect husband had been planning her murder long before she ever walked down the aisle. Brian Thompson and Alicia Rivera had what everyone believed was the ideal love story. Their wedding was the talk of the town, lavish, heartfelt, and captured in hundreds of photos that flooded social media. Alicia, a gentle and kind-hearted elementary school teacher, was admired for her calm nature and deep compassion. Brian, a confident software engineer, was known for his charisma and success. Their story seemed to come out of a fairy tale. High school friends who reconnected after a decade apart, fell in love quickly, and moved in together within months. Their engagement had been announced with a picturesque post from a mountaintop, captioned with a simple, "She said yes." Friends and family thought the match was perfect. Brian's co-workers described him as attentive and ambitious, while Alicia's colleagues recalled how she used to talk about him with sparkling eyes and unshakable faith in their future. They hosted dinners, shared vacations, and seemed deeply in sync. But not everyone was convinced. Alicia's sister, Daniela, noticed subtle changes. Alicia started to cancel plans more often and seemed distant during conversations. She brushed off concerns, attributing her behavior to work stress and wedding planning. The wedding itself was held in a vineyard in upstate New York. A sunny day, surrounded by friends, family, laughter, and tears of joy. Alicia wore a lace gown, and Brian, a custom-tailored suit. Their vows made people cry. There were no signs, at least none visible to the average onlooker, that anything was wrong. But deep down, Alicia was carrying fears she hadn't voiced aloud. A few days before the ceremony, she had a private conversation with her mother. She asked what it would mean to postpone a wedding. Her mother, thinking it was just pre-wedding nerves, reassured her that everything would be fine. Alicia never brought it up again. They left for their honeymoon just 24 hours after the wedding reception. The destination was a remote luxury coastal resort in Oregon, surrounded by rocky cliffs and thick forest. The perfect place, Brian had insisted, to disconnect and start their life together. Alicia wasn't thrilled about how far it was from civilization, but she agreed. She told her friends she was looking forward to time alone with Brian, away from the chaos. Upon arrival, they were greeted with champagne and a view of the endless ocean. Their cabin had large windows, a fireplace, and a balcony that overlooked the cliffs. Everything seemed tailored for romance. Alicia posted one final photo on her social media, her and Brian toasting glasses on the balcony at sunset. The caption read, "Forever starts here." But behind the walls of the honeymoon suite, things began to unravel. Resort staff later recalled seeing Alicia sitting alone in the lobby more than once. She seemed distracted, often fiddling with her wedding ring or scrolling through her phone with a blank expression. Brian, meanwhile, appeared polite but controlling. He was quick to answer on Alicia's behalf, often cutting conversations short. One housekeeper remembered walking in on them mid-argument. Alicia's voice was low and shaky. Brian had been pacing. On the second day of their stay, Alicia had called the front desk to ask about transportation options back to the nearest town. She claimed it was for sightseeing, but she never followed up. That same evening, guests staying in a nearby cabin reported hearing what they described as a thud followed by muffled sobs. No one thought much of it at the time. It was, after all, a honeymoon resort. Emotions ran high. The next morning, Brian appeared alone at the front office, frantic and breathless. He said he'd gone for a walk and returned to find Alicia missing. Hours later, he returned to report he had found her at the bottom of a cliff near the edge of the property. She was lifeless, bloodied, and her feet were bare. He claimed she had gone out to take pictures near the edge and must have slipped. Authorities arrived quickly. Search and rescue confirmed Alicia was dead. The official story given by Brian was that she had fallen accidentally. He was visibly shaken, crying as he explained how he found her. The resort guests and staff were horrified, believing a tragic accident had just cut short a promising new marriage. But as investigators began to comb through the details, inconsistencies began to surface. Something about the scene didn't add up. The fall seemed too far from the usual walking paths. Her phone was missing. Her shoes were found inside the cabin, neatly placed by the bed. And although the sun was up, no one had seen her leave the cabin that morning. What began as a fairy tale honeymoon was now the scene of a death investigation. And for those who knew Alicia best, a dark question had started to grow. Was it really an accident, or had something far more sinister occurred behind that perfect wedding veil? The morning Alicia's body was discovered, the resort fell into a stunned silence. Word spread quickly among the small number of guests. Staff members exchanged concerned glances as police vehicles arrived at the isolated property. Alicia had been found at the base of a rocky cliff, one of the steepest and most dangerous points near the edge of the resort grounds. Brian stood by with his arms crossed, looking hollow, repeatedly telling officers the same story, that his wife had gone for a walk on her own and must have slipped while taking photos. Detectives began their initial assessment, documenting the scene and interviewing everyone on the property. They noted the location of the body and the condition she was found in. Alicia had suffered multiple injuries, fractures, deep lacerations, and most notably, a large wound to the back of her head. There were scrapes on her arms and legs, and her fingernails were broken. Her face was pale, almost peaceful, as if the violence that led to her death had occurred in silence. The resort manager provided the reservation details, security camera access, and room keys. The couple had checked in 2 nights earlier, paid in advance for 5 days. They had not left the property since arriving. Staff members reported the couple keeping mostly to themselves. Brian was frequently alone, wandering the grounds or asking about hiking trails. Alicia had only been seen a few times, always briefly. One waiter described her as distant and tense, noting she barely touched her food during dinner. Serviced the night before her death, detectives entered the couple's cabin. The room was clean, but a closer inspection revealed signs of conflict. A lamp had been knocked over behind the couch. One pillow was on the floor. The bathroom mirror had smudges as if someone had leaned against it with damp hands. In the corner of the bedroom closet, behind a small suitcase, they found a crumpled shirt with dark red stains. It was Brian's size. The stains tested positive for blood. It was sent to the lab for further analysis. Outside the cabin, near the wooded edge of the cliff trail, officers found scattered leaves and disturbed soil. Drag marks led from the path to the spot where Alicia's body was discovered. It was steep, but not entirely inaccessible. A person could navigate it with some difficulty, but it would be dangerous alone, especially at night. Based on weather reports, the ground had been dry for days. There were no recent rains that might explain a sudden slip. Later that day, the medical examiner arrived on site to begin preliminary observations. Alicia's feet were bare, but her soles were clean, suggesting she hadn't walked outside on her own. Her hands had small bruises, and her knuckles appeared bruised and scraped. The position of her body and the lack of scrapes from the cliff face raised concerns. If she had fallen naturally, there would have been a pattern of impact. Instead, it looked as if she had been placed or thrown. Brian remained cooperative. He answered questions without hesitation, described the timeline of events, and repeatedly emphasized how devastated he was. He claimed they had gone to sleep early and that Alicia had woken up before him to catch the sunrise. He said he didn't realize she was missing until late morning. When asked why he didn't call for help immediately, he said he thought she had just gone exploring. He added that they often did things separately and gave each other space. He admitted they'd had a small argument the night before, but dismissed it as normal for newlyweds. Detectives pressed further. One officer noticed that Brian's hands had small scratches. He explained them as marks from walking through brush during his search for Alicia. When asked if Alicia had any reason to be upset or fearful, he insisted. She had been happy and excited about the honeymoon. His voice remained steady, his story consistent. But to the investigators, something about his demeanor felt rehearsed. Later that night, the crime scene team returned with a tracking dog. The dog picked up Alicia's scent near the cabin entrance, but not along the cliff path. There were no distinct tracks from Alicia's shoes outside. In fact, her shoes were still neatly placed under the bed. Her phone, purse, and sweater were all inside. Forensics began examining the bloodied shirt and sent Alicia's fingernail scrapings for lab analysis. The scratches on Brian's hands and arms were photographed. His clothes were taken for testing. While the official story remained that Alicia's death was an accident, the evidence began painting a different picture. There were too many questions, too many signs of a struggle, and too many inconsistencies in Brian's version of events. What had really happened during that second night on their honeymoon remained unclear. But investigators were beginning to suspect that what looked like a tragic fall might actually have been the end of something far more sinister, a plan years in the making. The autopsy results changed everything. While the initial theory pointed toward a tragic fall, the medical examiner's report dismantled that narrative entirely. Alicia's injuries were not consistent with slipping down a cliff. The most telling discovery was a blunt force trauma to the back of her skull, a blow powerful enough to cause immediate unconsciousness. This injury, the examiner concluded, had occurred before she ever left the cliff's edge. If she ever fell at all, there were more findings. Deep bruises were found on her forearms and shoulders, indicating she had been forcefully grabbed or restrained. Small contusions on her wrists pointed to her being held down. Her fingernails were cracked and embedded with skin particles. Alicia had fought back. Detectives were now looking at a possible homicide. The blood on the shirt found in the cabin matched Alicia's DNA. She had likely bled before her fall, again suggesting the injury happened inside the cabin or very close to it. Investigators returned to the resort to re-examine the cabin. This time, they brought a luminol spray to detect blood not visible to the eye. The results were damning. Traces of blood were found near the bathroom sink, the corner of the nightstand, and along the floor by the bed. Someone had tried to clean it up. Attention now turned to Brian. His behavior had raised suspicions early on, but now the forensic evidence was mounting. Officers interviewed more resort staff, and a clearer picture of Brian's time there began to emerge. He had requested cleaning supplies from housekeeping late the previous night, claiming he had spilled red wine. No wine. Bottle was found in the cabin. That same night, camera footage captured Brian leaving the cabin after midnight and heading toward the cliff path. He was dragging a large duffel bag behind him. The duffel bag had never been recovered. Investigators also spoke with Alicia's family, who provided additional insight into her state of mind in the months leading up to the wedding. Alicia had confided in her sister Daniela just weeks before the ceremony. She had said Brian had a temper. He had never left visible bruises, but his words were cruel and manipulative. He controlled who she saw, monitored her phone, and occasionally disappeared for days without explanation. Alicia had considered calling off the wedding, but Brian always found a way to convince her otherwise. Promises, apologies, emotional pleas. He had worn her down that a journal found in Alicia's suitcase added further depth to her fears. In it, she had written several short entries that hinted at her anxiety. One read, "He's different when no one is watching. I feel like I'm trapped in a room with someone who changes shape when the lights go out." Another entry, dated just 2 days before the wedding, said, "I'm scared, but I don't know if it's enough to run." Detectives pulled Brian's phone records next. What they found added another layer of motive. Just after the engagement, Brian had contacted a life insurance company. He had taken out a policy on Alicia's life worth $750,000. The timing was suspicious. Alicia hadn't known about the policy, and the paperwork showed her signature, but experts believed it was forged in addition to the insurance. His financial records revealed growing debt, credit card balances in the tens of thousands, and recent gambling activity. He had lost over $40,000 in the 6 months before the wedding. A sudden windfall from Alicia's death would have solved all of his problems. That a search of Brian's laptop and browser history confirmed what investigators had started to suspect. He had searched terms like how to stage a fall accident, how to clean blood from carpet, and undetectable poisons. Several of the pages were deleted but recovered through forensic software. There were also drafts of unsent emails, where Brian expressed regret about the wedding. One draft, written just 2 weeks before their honeymoon, read, "She's never going to leave, but I can't do this anymore. There's only one way out." At this point, the case had shifted fully into a homicide investigation. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was layered, consistent, and deeply incriminating. A warrant was issued for Brian's arrest, and officers tracked him down at a used car lot where he was in the process of trading in Alicia's vehicle. When he was taken into custody, he said nothing. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't protest. He just sat quietly in the back of the police car, staring out the window. The story that had once been hailed as a beautiful beginning was now a chilling tale of manipulation, control, and violence. Alicia's death was no accident. It had been calculated, methodical, and planned. But the story wasn't over yet. The court would soon decide whether Brian Thompson had pulled off the perfect murder or if justice would finally reach him. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Media had swarmed the courthouse, eager to cover what had become one of the most shocking domestic homicide cases in recent state history. Brian Thompson, once seen as the loving husband from a dreamy wedding, now stood behind a defense table, accused of premeditated murder. The prosecution came prepared with a mountain of evidence, physical, digital, and emotional, that painted a disturbing picture of control, motive, and cold-blooded planning. The trial opened with a detailed timeline of events, starting from the couple's engagement to Alicia's final moments. Prosecutors argued that Brian had carefully built an image of the perfect relationship while secretly planning his wife's murder for financial gain. They described how he initiated a life insurance policy shortly after the engagement and forged Alicia's signature without her knowledge. They emphasized his growing debt and gambling habits, suggesting a motive rooted in desperation and greed. The forensic evidence was presented next. Photographs of the bloodied shirt found behind the dresser. Images showing the luminol-lit trails of cleaned-up blood in the cabin. Autopsy reports highlighting injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. Experts testified that Alicia's death could not have been accidental. The head wound was from a deliberate strike, likely with a blunt object. One forensic analyst stated, with certainty, that Alicia was either unconscious or already dead before she ever reached the bottom of the cliff. Then came the digital trail. Investigators had pieced together months of Brian's online activity. His search history was introduced to the jury. Phrases like, "Can you get away with pushing someone off a cliff?" "Undetectable poisons," and "life insurance payout after accident." There were also recovered emails that Brian had written but never sent, expressing dissatisfaction with Alicia and even veiled hints at wanting her gone. One email draft read, "She's not the person I thought she was. I feel trapped, like this is my last chance to breathe." A key moment came when Alicia's personal journal was read aloud in court. Her words, filled with fear and quiet desperation, left a visible impact on the jury. One entry dated just weeks before the wedding read, "He's not who people think. He is. I love him, but I'm scared of what loving him is turning into. Another entry chillingly foreshadowed her fate. If anything happens to me, please know I didn't choose it. The defense tried to argue that Alicia's death was an unfortunate accident. They claimed she had been under stress, possibly distracted, while walking near the edge of the cliff. They suggested she could have slipped or fainted. Brian's lawyer painted him as a heartbroken man whose life had unraveled due to tragic circumstances. But the defense struggled to explain away the growing list of incriminating evidence. They had no answer for the forged insurance documents, the hidden shirt soaked in blood, or the fact that Alicia's shoes were still neatly placed in the cabin, untouched. The most damaging testimony came from a woman named Renee Porter, Brian's ex-girlfriend from 5 years earlier. She had come forward after hearing about Alicia's death. In court, she testified that Brian had once pushed her during an argument, causing her to fall and hit her head. She had never reported it, fearing no one would believe her. She also described how Brian would isolate her from friends and use threats masked as concern. Her testimony drew undeniable parallels between Alicia's experience and her OW in Thaddeus. The trial continued. The prosecution emphasized Brian's meticulous nature. They described how he had scouted the resort months in advance, chosen a location with poor cell service and minimal surveillance, and booked a cabin near a cliff with no fencing. They claimed every detail was intentional, part of a larger plan. To commit the perfect crime, the jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Brian stood motionless as the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder and insurance fraud. He showed no visible emotion. Alicia's family embraced one another as the weight of justice began to settle. Brian was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The judge called the crime a betrayal of the highest order, condemning the way Brian exploited trust, love, and vulnerability for personal gain. Alicia's mother addressed the court during sentencing, holding her daughter's journal in her hands. She said Alicia had once dreamed of a life filled with love and laughter, and instead spent her final days in fear, trapped by someone she once believed would protect her. What had started as a dream honeymoon had ended in unspeakable tragedy. But now, at least, the truth had been exposed, and the man behind the mask of the perfect husband had finally been unmasked. In the months following the trial, Alicia Rivera's name became a symbol of hidden abuse, silenced fears, and the importance of listening to what's not always said aloud. Her story struck a chord across the country, prompting conversations about the warning signs of emotional and physical control that often go unnoticed behind closed doors. A life that had been full of promise and warmth had been stolen not by a stranger, but by the very man she had promised forever to. Brian Thompson, now an inmate serving a life sentence, faded from public view. But the damage he left behind was far-reaching. Alicia's family, still mourning their loss, channeled their grief into purpose. Her sister Daniela took the lead in launching the Alicia Rivera Foundation, a nonprofit organization aimed at helping women in emotionally abusive relationships recognize the signs and seek support before it's too late. The foundation's mission was clear: prevent another Alicia by giving women the tools and community Alicia never had. Support groups were formed. Educational programs were offered in schools and workplaces. Survivors began to come forward and share their own stories, many of them eerily similar. Manipulation disguised as love, isolation masked as protection, control passed off as concern. The public, too, wrestled with the unsettling truth. How had a relationship that seemed so perfect unraveled into such horror? How could a man smile in wedding photos, then strike his bride days later? Friends of the couple replayed their last interactions with Alicia, wondering what signs they missed. Some remembered Alicia becoming quieter, her once lively spirit dimmed. Others recalled how Brian always answered questions for her or made dismissive jokes at her expense, things they once brushed off as harmless. Now, every small detail seemed like a missed opportunity to intervene. The national media continued to follow the case, producing documentaries, articles, and podcasts. One investigative program retraced the couple's last days at the Oregon resort, speaking with staff and analyzing the scene. They visited the cliff where Alicia had been found and the cabin where her final hours had likely played out. The program uncovered additional surveillance footage that had not been presented in court, grainy, but clear enough to show Brian carrying a large item out of the cabin and returning hours later, his clothes changed. It raised more questions than it answered, but reinforced one central truth. Alicia did not die by accident. In prison, Brian remained largely silent. He declined interview requests and never issued a statement of remorse. Reports from correctional officers described him as quiet, well-behaved, and emotionally detached. He spent most of his days alone, rarely interacting with other inmates. But in private, a different side began to emerge. A prison therapist later revealed that Brian had shown patterns of narcissistic behavior and a disturbing lack of empathy. He didn't speak of Alicia with sorrow or regret. He spoke of her as an inconvenience, someone who changed after the engagement, someone who made things difficult. To Brian, Alicia had become a problem he needed to solve, and he believed he had done just that. But outside the prison walls, Alicia's story lived on. Each year on the anniversary of her death, her family held a candlelight vigil in her memory. Hundreds attended, friends, teachers, students, and complete strangers moved by her story. They remembered her laughter, her dedication to her students, and her dream of building a family filled with warmth and safety. Her absence was felt most deeply in the classroom she once taught in. Her students, too young to understand the full weight of what happened, simply remembered her as the kind teacher with the bright smile who made learning feel like magic. As time passed, Alicia became more than a victim. She became a wake-up call. Her story was shared in training seminars for law enforcement officers, therapists, and educators. It was used to help identify red flags in relationships that might otherwise be dismissed. Her journal entries, once deeply personal, were published with her family's permission as part of a campaign to break the silence around emotional abuse. What began as a tragic story of love turned lethal evolved into something larger. Alicia's death exposed a terrifying truth about the dangers that can exist behind seemingly perfect relationships. But in its aftermath, it also sparked change, saved lives, and gave voice to those too afraid to speak. Her story, once hidden in whispers and private pain, became a powerful reminder that love should never hurt, and that sometimes the greatest danger wears the warmest smile.